Okay, and we are live. We have a studentless class tonight. That's okay. We're going to record, and you guys can check this out at your leisure. The 8th ground session is concerning air traffic control. We're going to do an introduction to air traffic control topics. We're going to touch on some of the general phraseology that you hear on frequency. We'll talk about some of the regulations as it concerns, who you contact and who you talk to, when you have to talk to them. We'll also touch on some more cockpit tools, such as we'll review transponders and the emergency locator transmitter, stuff like that. So pretty action-packed class. We're going to also take some time to share the live ATC feed, and we're going to listen in on some live air traffic control if we can get so lucky as to hear some good radio chatter. So anyway, air traffic control is the total focus for this evening's class, and let's jump right into it. So there are different kinds of air traffic control, and I'm going to step down from the highest level, or the broadest level, I'll call it, straight down to the very specific airport specific level. When you start at the very top, as it concerns air traffic control, the United States has what are called Air Route Traffic Control Centers, ARTCCs. In aviation lingo, it's simply called center or center controller. You can see the United States is broken up into a handful of Air Route Traffic Control Center regions. And as you transition on long cross countries from region to region, you'll get handed off to these individual controlling agencies. Texas is predominantly Fort Worth Center, which is the Zulu Foxtrot Whiskey here, North Texas, and then Houston Center down here at the bottom. Texas also deals with Albuquerque Center out here to the west, but not quite as much as the two big ones, Houston and Fort Worth. And like I said, the center controlling agencies are the most broad. And when you look at airspace over the United States, they control most of the airspace. The airspace that they do not control happens to be the airspace surrounding airports, such as Class Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Golf. They also do not control the airspace that the approach controlling agencies control. So I've attempted to depict approach and departure controlling agencies with these blue boxes here around our airports. If you guys remember, the airport airspaces, Class Bravo and Class Delta. I don't have a Class Charlie up here, but surrounding our airport airspaces is going to be approach and departure control. And then one level up from that is center control outside of the approach and departure control areas. So as you go on your cross countries, when you leave the approach departure control jurisdiction, you will be within the Air Route Traffic Control Center, or the center's jurisdiction. The approach departure control is the next level down, and they have jurisdiction over some of the country's busier terminal areas. So using Dallas-Fort Worth airspace as an example that I have on the screen, this quote-unquote fictitious picture shows the DFW airspace split up between 4 different frequencies. Now, I say fictitious because in real life, the different sectors are not perfectly rectangular like this, and there are more than 4. I believe the exact number is 7 or 8. But I drew this on the screen just so you could get a feel for the fact that the approach and departure control areas have their own sectors by frequency. And when you're transitioning from center control, which I'm showing to be kind of outside of that square area, when you're transitioning from center control into approach control, you're going to go through a frequency change. So let's say this is my flight path into Fort Worth Spinks Airport. I'm going to be communicating with the center controller out here. And as soon as I transition outside of the center controller's sector and into the approach controller sector, I'm going to be given a frequency change, 124.5. And the reverse is true. If I'm departing, let's say I'm departing Lancaster Airport, Lima, November, Charlie, and I'm flying southbound, if I'm on a VFR flight following using air traffic control services, I'm going to be talking to the approach controller on 123.4. And once I transition outside of his sector, I'm going to be handed off to center. I'll be asked to contact center, Fort Worth Center on XYZ frequency. So using the Fort Worth Center outline here, the DFW regional approach, as it's called, is right in here. And I've attempted to, quote unquote, fictitiously depict this region right here with these multicolored boxes. Make sense? Good. Good deal. Now, as you get even more specific within the approach control sector, you will encounter tower control for controlled airspace. So, of course, we know that controlled airspace are the blue depicted airports on our sectional. And the uncontrolled airspace, or the uncontrolled airports, are the magenta, if you remember from a couple classes ago. So for our tower-controlled blue airports, the air traffic control tower has jurisdiction over a radius or a specific area surrounding the airport. Now, just a disclaimer, I've put this box here around Bush Intercontinental Airport's tower control region, just as an illustration. It's probably not this, the geographic sector is probably not this exact. However, it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. As you are transitioning in for landing, you're going to be talking to the approach controller out here, and you will be handed off to tower frequency, or the tower controller, once you enter their sector. You'll be asked to make a frequency change to the tower frequency so that you can be cleared for landing. Similarly, on departure, you will receive your takeoff clearance from the tower controller, And as you transition outside of the tower sector, you'll go from speaking with the tower controller to getting a frequency change and then talking to departure control. Now, I know what you're thinking. Adam, you just said that outside of this box, it's approach control. Well, approach control and departure control are actually the same person. When you're talking to the approach and departure controller on the other side of the microphone, you're talking to the same exact individual. When you are departing from a controlled airfield, or uncontrolled for that matter, and you're transitioning to the approach control sector, on your departure, you're going to identify the controller as the departure controller, although other folks on the frequency may be referring to him as the approach controller. It's the same individual. Your use of the term departure signifies that you have just departed from either a controlled or an uncontrolled airfield. When you transition in for arrival, you will utilize the term approach. So hopefully that makes sense. On departure, you'll refer to this control sector as the departure controller. And then on approach, you'll refer to that individual as the approach controller, although it is the same person. So just real quick, just a quick review over the control sectors. The most broad, largest, least specific controlling agency is the center. And as you get closer to the busy terminal areas, such as DFW or Houston, you will transition from center to approach control. And then finally, if you are flying into a controlled airfield, you will transition from approach control to tower control. Now let's talk a little bit about non-towered or uncontrolled or magenta airports. Because once you transition from approach, you're not going to be doing a frequency change to a tower controller. Instead, within these class Gulf airports, the approach controller is going to ask you to switch frequencies to what's called a common traffic advisory frequency. And the approach controller is likely going to use the simplified term advisory frequency. If you remember, outside of the magenta shading on the solid side, approach control will have Class E, Class Echo airspace down to 1,200 feet. And then within the terminal area, which is the faded side of the magenta shade, approach control will have Class E jurisdiction down to 700 feet. It's important to note that although it's not necessarily the rule, the controller is likely not to have radar coverage below these altitudes. And it's very possible that depending on the terrain, he may not have radar coverage to these altitudes. So you may hear upon landing at Granbury, and I'll just use Granbury as an example, at, let's say, 1,000 feet when your airplane is right here, inbound, the controller will notify you that radar services are terminated. Hence, he can no longer see you on his radar scope, and he will authorize you to change to advisory frequency in a similar manner that he would tell you to change to tower frequency if this was a towered controlled airport. So that's the non-towered, uncontrolled scenario. Your approach controller will transition you to what's called the CTAF, or the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, at a point that is appropriate whether that be a point when he loses you on his radar scope or a point when he decides that you've got the airport in sight and you verified that, and there's a general understanding that you can switch frequencies to make a safe landing. Now, once we are on the ground, using the last example of an uncontrolled airport with no air traffic control tower, it's simple. You really don't have to talk to anybody. Once you've landed, it's up to each pilot individually to maintain communications on the CTAF, the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, to ensure separation and avoid ground incursions. However, at a controlled field with an air traffic control tower, there will be a ground control frequency, which typically is just referred to as ground. You will receive a frequency reassignment over to ground once you have landed and exited the active runway. And that frequency will be assigned by the tower. The ground controller has jurisdiction over all the movement areas of the airport. And the movement areas are denoted by taxiways that have a letter, such as taxiway Foxtrot, taxiway Charlie 1, Charlie 2, hotel, so on and so forth. Once you leave what's called the movement area, which is typically denoted by a set of double yellow lines, and those double yellow lines will typically be somewhere near the edge of a parking area, maybe the exit or entrance to a taxiway headed out to the runway. And that signifies that you have moved into the non-movement area, which ground control doesn't necessarily have jurisdiction over. It'll be up to each individual pilot to really understand the airport that they're operating at. And to be honest, it never hurts to always monitor and communicate with ground control regardless of where you are on the airport grounds. But when you are in the ground control sector, meaning on these taxiways, it's required that you receive clearances to taxi and that you are in communication with ground control at all times. Okay, now, since we have gone over the general overview of the different controlling agencies, I am going to kind of flip back through the slides and talk about what kind of communications occur on these frequencies. And I didn't want to do that when we went through the slides originally because there's a lot of information to pick up here. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. And I'm going to just briefly talk about what kind of communications, requests, typical things that you're going to hear between pilots and controllers in each of these different areas. The center controller is primarily involved with the control of aircraft that are in the en route phase of their flight, meaning they're typically at their cruise altitude. They either are starting or finishing a climb or starting or finishing a descent, but they're definitely not taking off, and they're likely not landing. Center controllers usually handle the aircraft that are already in their cruise phase of flight. So the majority of requests or clearances or discussion or the chatter on this frequency pertain to the en route phase. So you'll hear a lot of heading changes, requests for altitude change coming from the pilot. You'll hear a lot of weather discussion, pilots asking controllers about weather, controllers asking pilots about weather. A lot of times the controllers are curious if the weather reports that they have on the ground are accurate as they are up in the sky. There is not a lot of discussion about speed restrictions or approach configurations. It's pretty simple discussion here with the center controller. We talked last class about some of the military operations areas. The center controllers are going to have information on whether those areas are hot or not. So the center controller is predominantly just your en route cruise controller, and you'll get handed off from sector to sector as you make your way through the sky. Now transition over to approach and departure control, and this is where things get a little bit more busy. Of course, there's also a lot of chatter regarding headings and altitudes. The controller at this point is making a lot of the heading and altitude requests. They will be vectoring aircraft that are on instrument flight plans through the sky, giving them different vectors and headings and speed restrictions as they make their way to their respective airports. Keep in mind that in the approach sectors, there's a lot of airplanes performing their final descent as well as their departure climb outs. So there's a lot more happening in these sectors. Aircraft changing altitude quickly, changing speed quickly, changing directions quickly. And so from an air traffic control perspective, the approach and departure frequencies are usually the busiest. And this is when you have to be on your game the most if you're on a VFR flight following. And tower control. Tower control is accountable for giving out takeoff and landing clearances. And if able, meaning if they have radar capability, they will give vectors and altitude assignments. Most of the bigger, well, all of the bigger airports and most of the Class Charlie and Class Delta airport control towers have radar capability. So once handed off to the tower controller from approach, the tower will also be able to monitor your altitude, your heading, and your speed. You will be able to tell if a tower controller does not have this capability, as he may come across the frequency and ask you to verify your altitude, your speed, position, or some other parameter that he or she cannot get without radar. So a portion of the tower controller's duties and a portion of the communications are altitudes and vectors, but predominantly the tower controller is accountable for issuing landing clearances to landing aircraft and takeoff clearances to takeoff aircraft. And then Class G, of course, is every man for themselves, all the pilots on the same frequency. And predominantly when you are on the common traffic advisory frequency for an airport, you will be issuing self-issuing position reports. So you'll make an announcement that you're inbound. You'll announce your entry to the traffic pattern. You'll make different announcements around the traffic pattern to ensure that any existing traffic knows where you are. And then once you're on the ground, you'll let everybody know whether you're headed back for takeoff or you're going to parking. So the CTAF, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, is the medium of communication whereby each pilot allows every other pilot on the frequency to know where they are, where they're going. And of course, ground frequency that we just talked about a little while ago is the ground controller is accountable for issuing taxi clearances and clearances to cross runways. There is a very big, and there has been a very big awareness movement regarding runway and taxiway incursions. What you'll notice when you start your flight training and what your flight instructor will teach you very early on, if you're at a controlled airfield especially, is you have to be very cognizant, and you actually must read back verbatim any runway clearance or any hold short clearance from the controller. And what that means is, let's say you are at this flight school and you request a taxi to runway 17 for takeoff. So Sugarland Ground, Cessna 1234 at the flight school with information Alpha, request taxi 17 VFR. And then the ground controller is going to acknowledge, November 1234, Sugarland Ground, taxi, runway 17 via Charlie 2 and Foxtrot. And if there was a crossing runway at Sugarland, which there's not, and let's say this is runway 26, the controller would physically have to clear you across 26. It would not be enough for him to say, clear runway 17 via Charlie 2, Foxtrot. He would have to say, Cessna November 1234, Sugarland Ground, taxi runway 17 via Charlie 2, cross runway 26, Foxtrot. And then you would have to verbatim read that back. This is a very important point. It's on your written test. And as well, you have to verbatim read back any hold short clearance. So if the controller were to say to you, November 1234, Sugarland Ground, taxi runway 17, hold short runway 26, then you would have to respond, Sugarland Ground, November 1234, taxi 17, hold short runway 26, verbatim, and you would have to stop your airplane right here and not cross runway 26. The reason you're getting that clearance is the controller's expecting some activity on runway 26, whether it be a landing or a taking off aircraft. So runway crossing clearances and hold short clearances are extremely, extremely important when you're working with a ground controller at a controlled airport. Okay, a couple more notes on non-towered fields and communication requirements at non-towered fields. We talked about the CTAF. And here's 3 points that I kind of cherry picked out of the written test study guides that it's just important for you guys to know as you continue your studying and you start your flight training. You will always see a frequency next to our CTAF symbol right here. And that frequency right there is the CTAF frequency, 123.0 in this case. However, if this is not available on your sectional, the default CTAF frequency, and they call it multicom, is 122.9. So there will be times when you're flying around the skies of Texas and you decide to land somewhere that does not have a frequency on the chart. And it's understood that every pilot that utilizes that airfield is going to use 122.9. So in the absence of no frequency, 122.9. The FAA has made a suggestion that every pilot operating in the vicinity of an uncontrolled field contact that airport and their CTAF frequency when you are 10 miles away from the airport. I'll be honest with you, a lot of pilots do not follow this. Just from observation, 5 miles is a very popular checkpoint, I would say, for calling in to a non-towered airport. Just remember, the sooner you call the sooner you can understand what the traffic situation looks like at that airport. And of course, the sooner you can mentally prepare for how you're going to enter what could potentially be a very busy traffic pattern full of airplanes. And then finally, the uncontrolled fields will have a CTAF, as we discussed, or it may not. And it will also likely have what's called a unicom. And what the unicom is used for is non-traffic advisory subject matter. For example, we're on the CTAF and we're inbound and we announce our position. Cessna November 1234, 10 miles to the south, inbound for landing Granbury. And we make a successful traffic pattern and we land and we taxi off the runway, and we want to get some other kind of advisory, such as, where can I get fuel? Where is parking? Something that does not have to do with the operations of the traffic in and out of that airport. The CTAF should be solely used for ground, landing, departing traffic to announce yourself and your position and your intentions. If you need to ask about a fuel price, or if Joe Smith is in the hangar today, you switch over to the unicom frequency, which will be different than the CTAF frequency, so that you can have those kind of discussions. It's an attempt to ensure that there's very little non-essential traffic discussions going on the CTAF frequency. I know when I started my training, I was at a non-towered field. I would typically start my flights on the unicom frequency. I would start the engine, and right before I would taxi, I would dial up on the unicom, and I would request wind conditions from whoever was sitting behind the desk at the terminal. We had a weather station in the little airport terminal, and I would state Penridge Unicom, November 1234, radio check, request wind conditions. These are non-traffic related, non-essential to the actual flow of traffic throughout the airport grounds. And so that individual would say, Cessna November 1234, Penridge Unicom, I hear you loud and clear, and wind is 090 at 5. And so that's what you use the unicom frequency for. Okay, another air traffic control tool, a little bit different than air traffic control that we've been talking about, is what's called an ATIS. Automated Terminal Information Service. And the ATIS is an air traffic control frequency where the governing controlling agency, which is typically an airport, will delegate non-control information to a recorded message. This is very similar, by the way, to the unicom frequency we just discussed in principle. It's not the same type of service, but in principle, it's got the same idea. As you take off and land at controlled airfields, there are certain information that is non-essential to the control or the traffic flow at the airport. And that information is recorded in a message that is updated on the hour. And it's called the ATIS. And information included in the ATIS is active runways, weather information, select NOTAMs, which is notices to airmen, and other things that aren't necessarily critical to the safe operation of aircraft taking off and landing. And I'm going to pull up our ATIS. Let's see if we can pull up an ATIS frequency here. Now we're going to go. We're going to pull up a recording. Actually, bear with me a minute. I'm going to use my phone because I have got my Bluetooth speaker hooked up to it, so 2 seconds. Oh, we got to listen to an ad real quick.
$300 off the Samsung Galaxy S8.
Okay, here's the ATIS.
This is track number 68.
Los Angeles International Airport information offer 23530. Wind 260 at 13. Visibility 10. Your clouds at 8,000. Temperature 2.13. Altimeter 2984. Remark. AO2 sea level pressure not available mode. Your clouds 8,000 10222020056012. ILS approach is in progress to runway 24 right and 25 left, or vector for visual approach will be provided. Simultaneous visual approaches to all runways are in progress, and parallel approaches are in progress between Los Angeles International Airport and Hawthorne Airport. Simultaneous instrument departure in progress runway 24 and 25. Notices to airmen. Taxiway Tango and Sierra closed between Bravo and Charlie. Taxiway Sierra and Quebec closed.
So you can hear some of the non-traffic information that computerized voice was going through, and how it is essential to the operation of the airport, but it has nothing to do with the flow of traffic coming in and out. I mean, they were publishing taxiway closures, runway closures. You heard the weather information there at the beginning. Let me see if this one is a little bit easier to hear. That one's not very good. But when you come to or when you arrive and depart from a controlled airfield, the expectation from air traffic control is that you're going to listen to the ATIS. It is a requirement. So inbound to any airport that has the ATIS frequency, prior to getting your clearance to enter that airspace and make a landing, you'll have to tell the approach controller and or the tower controller that you have the ATIS information. And I mentioned the information's updated every hour. Every hour it is given a letter, a phonetic letter identifier. So and it's given the prefix information. So the first report of the day is information alpha, and then after an hour it'll be updated again, and you'll have information bravo, and then information Charlie, so on and so forth. So as you're coming into land, or if you're taking off, and you need to let the tower controller know that you've listened to the ATIS, you can verify that by saying, you know, DFW Tower, Cessna 1234 has information, whatever, information Charlie. And that controller knows that you have listened to the automated message. If you listen to an ATIS weather report and you don't hear any sky conditions or visibility, it's assumed that the sky is better than 5,000 feet and the visibility is better than 5 miles. So typically, you on very nice days, you will not hear sky conditions or visibility. Okay, so that was an overview of all the different air traffic controlling agencies. We talked center controller, which is the biggest and broadest, approach and departure, which is your next step down, tower controller or CTAF, depending on whether we're operating in and out of controlled airfields or not, and ground control. So those are the main air traffic controlling agencies that you're going to deal with on VFR and IFR flight. So let's transition into a little bit of phraseology, which after you start to understand who to talk to and you know which sector you're dealing with, whether it be approach or center or tower, you know, the phraseology is the next thing that you really focus on, and it's a lot to focus on. There's you know, there's a lot of pilots and controllers that are doing this every day, and so as you kind of listen to liveatc.net, it all goes by really fast. But I can assure you that everybody's been educated on what is known as standard phraseology. I've got the term general up here on the screen, but I really should change this to standard. It's called standard phraseology as far as the FAA is concerned. And I've got a couple. Certainly, this is not an exhaustive list. This is a almost complete list. There's a lot of standard ways to say things, but these are the main ones. Different numbers and figures. I'm just going to go top to bottom, and we'll talk about it a little bit. So altitudes are denoted in hundreds and thousands up to 10,000 feet, and then you start using a quirky style of altitude phraseology, like 10,000 instead of 10,000, or 14,000 instead of 14,000. Once you get above 18,000 feet, or 18,000, they start to describe altitudes in terms of flight levels. I think we mentioned that in a prior session. So it's not 26,000 feet. It's not 26,000 feet. It's flight level 260. Victor 12, the Victor 12 airway. A lot of IFR airways have a prefix V or Victor with a number. Digits such as headings and runways are not said or are not phrased in the way you typically phrase them in everyday life. So you're not going to say turn to a heading of 328. You'll say turn to a heading of 328. There's much too much variability in trying to utilize the shorthand method, like 328, 161, 87. Each digit is spoken. So it's not runway 24, it's runway 24. It's not a heading of 178, it's a heading of 178. All times are spoken in terms of Zulu. When you're flying the airplane, you're typically always reciting times to and from air traffic control in terms of the universal coordinated time, which is Zulu time. Zulu time this time of year is 6 hours ahead of us if you're in Texas. And if you're in New York City, it's 5 hours ahead. Once we turn the clocks back, of course, that'll change, because Zulu time, they do not practice daylight savings like the United States does. If you do have to use local time, you just want to make sure it's obvious to who you're talking to that you're using local time. But start getting into the habit of using Zulu time. It's it'll make it a lot easier when you have to use it on the fly in the airplane. And then just some general phraseology that you're going to hear between pilots and controllers. Roger, copy. That simply means that you have heard and understood what that person on the other side of the radio has told you. It doesn't, and there's a kind of a common misconception. Roger doesn't necessarily mean that you agree to or will comply with, but it simply means that you have understood. So turn heading 150, if the controller says that and the pilot says Roger, it just means that he's heard the controller and he's understood him. It's not until the pilot recites the request that the controller can be fully confident that he's going to comply with the clearance. On the flip side, affirmative and negative is an indication that whatever the person on the radio has said to you, you agree with, maybe you will comply with it. So let me give you an example. You're flying along at 5,000 feet, and let's say maybe you're having some transponder issues, so the controller loses track of your altitude. After a certain period of time, the controller is required to verify what your altitude is because it's fallen off his radar scope. So the controller is going to say, Cessna November 1234, Houston Center, verify altitude 5,000 feet. The pilot, if he's going to state it correctly, will respond, Roger, Houston Center, November 1234, altitude 5,000 feet. That is a correct way to respond. Another correct way to respond is with the term affirmative. By stating affirmative, the pilot has indicated that whatever the controller has said is correct. So if the controller says, November 1234, Houston Center, verify altitude 5,000 feet, you could simply respond, affirmative, Houston Center. And then as an extra, I guess, step of verification, you could say, November 1234, altitude 5,000 feet. It's important to note that by saying Roger, that just means to the controller that he's been heard and understood. It doesn't mean that the pilot has agreed with his altitude assumption. So if you were to say, if the controller were to say, November 1234, Houston Center, verify 5,000 feet, and the pilot comes back and says, Roger, Houston Center, all that means is that the pilot has heard the controller. It does not mean that he is verifying the altitude. The controller will likely come back and say, copy that, November 1234, I need you to verify your altitude. And that's when the pilot will come back and do so. So just keep in mind, the terms affirmative and negative are describing your agreement or disagreement with what someone on the frequency is telling you. Roger and copy signify that you've heard and understood that person. An example of negative might be, let's say you're flying along at 5,000 feet, heading 180, and the controller comes across and says, Cessna 1234, Houston Center, verify you have traffic at your 3 o'clock and 5 miles traveling northbound. And you take a look at your 3 o'clock and see if you can find the traffic. If you can't find the traffic, your response would be Houston Center, November 1234, negative traffic. That means that you do not agree or do not have or cannot comply, not able to perform what the controller is asking you to do, which is verify that you have the traffic. So just keep that in mind. Roger and copy means I heard you. Affirmative, negative mean I agree, disagree. I can, I won't. etc. Standby and correction are typically used, you know, when you've got either some confusion on the frequency or you need some time to come up with your response. You know, a lot of times controllers will ask of something that may not be critical at the moment, and the pilot will be comfortable saying standby. The traffic example is another good one. You know, November 1, 2, 3, 4, Fort Worth Center, traffic at your 4 o'clock, 1,000 feet below you, traveling southbound. Report traffic in sight. My immediate response typically is, you know, Fort Worth Center, November 1, 2, 3, 4, stand by, looking for traffic. And then you'll hear the term correction when somebody on the frequency wants to correct what they previously said. So, you know, if a controller states November 1, 2, 3, 4, Albuquerque Center, turn heading 130, and then mid-sentence decides that's not a good heading, he'll say turn heading 130, correction 140, and then the pilot is expected to read back the corrected value. And then you've got the unable. That that is exactly how it sounds. If you're given a request or you know that you're not able to comply with, you state unable. You know, if you land at a controlled airfield, for example, and the tower controller, and you're doing your landing rollout, and you're going from 100 miles an hour to 90 to 80, and you're getting on the brakes because you need to turn off the runway, you know, tower controller might say, you know, Cessna November 1, 2, 3, 4, Houston Tower, have a citation on a 3-mile final, turn at taxiway Charlie. And if Charlie's coming at you at like 40 miles an hour and you're going to pass it, you would simply state Houston Tower, Cessna November 1, 2, 3, 4, unable. And it's basically understood that you are not able to comply with that request. Okay, so this is just some pretty typical standard phraseology that you're going to hear. You know, the figures, like I said, that is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of examples. Probably the best practice you can do is listening to liveatc.net and just trying to keep up with what everybody's saying on the radio. Speaking of which, looking at the clock here, we might have some time to listen in really quick, and maybe if we want to, we can do some commentary on it as well. Let's go over to Sugarland. See if there's any chatter on the frequency.
0 Mike, contact Houston departure 123.8.
So if you heard that one, I didn't have the speaker up to the mic, but if you heard that one, you could hear the tower controller authorizing some departing aircraft to transfer their frequency over to departure. So that was an airplane on an IFR flight plan that was leaving the tower sector and transitioning to the approach departure sector. So not sure if you heard that one, but that's what that was. Okay, we'll keep going here, and then if I hear someone come across a frequency, we'll stop. It's actually pretty good practice because you have to become pretty good at talking because you've got passengers and you've got flight instructors. You got to talk to each other, and then if you're talking air traffic control, you got to be very good about stopping your conversation to listen in and to hear for your call sign. So we'll so long as it's not too distracting while we walk through some of this stuff. I'll keep the frequency on.
Up to 0, proceed as requested, monitor ground, have a good one.
Sounds like somebody.
15 Alpha, runway 17, clear for the option. Clear for the option, runway 1715 Alpha.
Okay, so this pilot is in the traffic pattern, and he's been given a cleared for the option clearance. And so what this means, I'm actually glad this came up because I did not talk about this. Cleared for the option is a special fancy way to say cleared for landing. This airplane is in the traffic pattern doing circuits, and the air traffic controller, the tower controller at Sugarland, has cleared the pilot for the option. And what that means is upon landing, the pilot can make a full stop landing, meaning he can land on the runway, stop, taxi off. He can do a touch and go, which means he can land on the runway, maintain his speed, and take back off. He can do a stop and go landing, which means he can land on the runway, stop his airplane in the middle of the runway, and then start his airplane again, go moving forward and take off on the same runway. And then he can also do what's called a low approach, meaning he can come down to the runway, not land, and just do a low pass across the runway threshold and take back off. So that's what that request was, or that clearance was. And what you heard was, Cessna November 1, 2, 3, 4 cleared for the option, and then the pilot responded to the tower controller by saying, by reciting the clearance, which is a requirement. Cleared for the option, November 1, 2, 3, 4. So that was a good one. Let's listen in. Okay. Well, see if some more chatter happens. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about contact procedures. Now, we've talked about the different air traffic control sectors and jurisdictions. We've talked a little bit about phraseology. We've touched on controlled versus non-controlled airfields. Let's discuss some contact procedures, what to say, how to say it, who says what. I'm going to walk through several examples, so this will be a good kind of introductory overview and should get you pretty comfortable with learning more, is what I'll say. There's so much to learn with regard to this topic, but this will provide a very meaningful introductory overview. So at the very basic level, a interaction between a pilot and a controller can be broken down into 4 main areas or steps. And when you're contacting a controller, these are the 4 steps that you're going to broadly think about and kind of segment your mental activity into as you're contacting them. Probably the most uncomfortable or hardest thing to get used to is when you hit that microphone key, what comes out of your mouth. And for a new pilot, a new student, it gets a little crazy. You'll hit the mic key and you'll be like, all right, shoot, what now? So I break it down into these 4 fundamental areas. The name of the facility you're talking to, number 1. Number 2, your full aircraft identification, call sign, and type. Number 3, where you are, like your aircraft position. And finally, number 4, what your request is or what your intentions are. Now, depending on what the topic of conversation is, you'll either be making a request or you will be stating intentions. You'll be, either asking air traffic control to do something, or you'll be telling them what you're going to do if it's something that you don't need to ask permission for. So let's go through some examples. So a Class Bravo or Class Charlie approach to landing.
Left midfield for runway 17 full stop.
Just 15 Alpha, one more departure heady, extend downwind, won't be too far.
Roger, extending downwind 15 Alpha.
All right, got some more chatter there. air traffic controller, the tower controller at Sugarland, asked the pilot who called in to extend their downwind leg in the traffic pattern. We haven't talked about traffic pattern legs yet, but the downwind leg is the leg that's parallel to the runway. And simply the pilot just recited back the request. We'll extend our downwind November 1, 2, 3, 4. Sounded like the tower controller had to get another airplane through the system there before he allowed that other pilot to make a turn towards the runway for landing. So, okay. So we're
Stream 463 Mike Alpha, Sri Lanka, tower, you up and ready?
We're going to be just 1 second, sir.
No problem, take your time. That's the 15 Alpha, runway 17, clear to land.
Clear to land, runway 1715 Alpha.
There you go. Tower controller just issued a landing clearance. Okay, so our approach to landing at a Class BC airport. Of course, we're gonna call up the name of the facility first. So regional approach. Next step is we're gonna recite our aircraft identification and call sign. November 1125 Tango is type PA-28 Romeo. This is the type of aircraft I'm flying. Alternatively, you might be flying a Cessna. You might be flying a Learjet. But the tower controller is going to want to, or I'm sorry, any controller really, in this case, the approach controller, is going to want to know what he's dealing with so he can think about speed and separation, etc. So full aircraft's call sign and type. November 1125 Tango is type PA-28R. Then your aircraft position, 5 miles west of the Cowboy VOR. And then my request or my intentions, inbound Dallas Love Field with information Romeo. So here's who I'm talking to, my identification and my type, my aircraft position, and what am I doing or what am I requesting. Okay. Now let's go. I've got the responses to this over here. Typical.
Gulfstream 3 Mike Alpha is ready.
Gulfstream 3 Mike Alpha, hold short, runway 17.
Okay, we're holding short 173 Mike Alpha.
There you go. There's a hold short request or clearance. You heard the pilot recite or restate verbatim the hold short request. So there you go. All right. So back to our example. Regional approach, November 1125 Tango is type PA-28, 5 miles west of the Cowboy VOR, inbound Dallas Love Field with information Romeo. Check this out. I told the controller that I had the ATC. Information Romeo. Remember, it's given that alpha or the phonetic designation. In this case, it's information Romeo. Okay. And then the tower or the approach controller is going to speak to me in a similar fashion that I've spoken to him. He's going to identify himself. He's going to first state who he's talking to, and then he's going to identify himself. So first of all, who am I talking to? November 1125 Tango. He's going to identify.
15 Alpha, turn left at Charlie 2, taxi to Anson, and monitor ground point 4.
Left at Charlie 2, taxi to Anson, monitor ground point 4, 15 Alpha.
So
Gulfstream 3 Mike Alpha, fly runway heading, maintain 2000, runway 17, cleared for takeoff.
Okay, we're going to stay on the runway heading, and we're climbing to 2,000 feet. We are clear for takeoff 173 Mike Alpha.
all right, that's good stuff. Hopefully the more you guys listen to this, it'll start to click more and more. So like I was saying, the regional controller is going to recite similar to the way he, or the way that we contacted him. He's going to, first, he's going to state who he's talking to. Then he's going to identify himself. And then he's going to give us a request or tell us to do something. So November 1125 Tango, regional approach, Squawk 3874, and that squawk number is what I'm going to punch into my transponder.
Tower FlexJet 441 with you, about a 4-mile right base for 17.
FlexJet 441, Sugarland Tower, good evening. Runway 17, clear to land.
FlexJet 441, clear to land 17, thank you.
All right. I'm going to put this on pause real quick so I can finish this example. This is all good stuff. I'm really enjoying that live feed. So, if you guys remember when we talked transponders, the transponder is designed to help the controller see us on his radar scope. It's a device in the aircraft that communicates with radar. And so we're going to put this code into the transponder, 3874. So November 1125 Tango, regional approach, squawk 3874. So our response, we're going to recite the request. Squawk 3874, November 1125 Tango. And regardless of what that request is, we're going to recite it. If he would have said, November 1125 Tango, regional approach, maintain 2,000 feet, turn heading 120, we'd say the same thing. Maintain 2,000 feet, heading 120, November 1125 Tango. So you're basically going to recite whatever the clearance and or request and or thing that the controller says to you right here. Okay, and then if we're in an approach environment with radar coverage, radar services for VFR aircraft, after we punch in our code to the transponder, the controller is going to verify that he's got us on radar. So he'll come back, November 1125 Tango again. He, just like we did, he starts by calling out who he's talking to. So November 1125 Tango, radar contact 4 miles west of Cowboy VOR, and then another request or another clearance. Maintain 2,000 feet, make right downwind, runway 13 right. So just a couple things to note. Each time we're talking to each other, the first thing we say is, who are we talking to? Who is the facility, or who is the airplane if it's the controller's case? That's what the first thing you're always listening for is, who's he talking to, or who am I talking to? And then the second thing to really take away from this is, whatever you're requested to do, or whatever your clearance is, you've got to recite it. So if a controller said maintain 2,000 feet, make right downwind runway 13 right, my response is going to be, we will maintain 2,000 feet and make right downwind runway 13 right, November 1125 Tango. And you finish with your call sign to confirm to the controller that it was you who was talking. Okay? So you can see how breaking it up into when you're contacting the controlling facility, breaking it up into these 4 general areas is extremely helpful. Who am I contacting? Identify myself. Where am I at? And what do I want to do? Let's walk through a couple more examples. Okay, I've got a class Bravo, Charlie, or Delta taxi request. Now, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, of course, those are our blue controlled airports, blue airports on the chart. They are going to have a ground controller. So if I'm sitting on the ramp, that is the first person I need to talk to if I want to taxi anywhere, typically for takeoff. So back to the 4 main areas. Who am I calling? Who am I? Where am I at? And what do I want to do? DFW ground. November 1125 Tango is type PA28. At the general aviation ramp. Request taxi VFR to the active. Have information kilo. And I'm doing a little bit of shorthand here, but active is short for active runway. Whatever runway is currently active for takeoffs and landings, that's where I want to taxi. So who am I calling? DFW ground. What's my identification? November 1125 Tango. And what's my type? PA28. Where am I at? At the general aviation ramp. What do I want to do? Taxi VFR to the active. I have information kilo. This is my ATIS information kilo. And the controller is going to respond to me. Very, again, very similar to how I contacted him. Who's he talking to? November 1125 Tango. Who is he? DFW Ground. And he's going to acknowledge and approve my request by giving me a clearance. Taxi runway 18 left via taxiway Alpha. Then, of course, I'm going to respond to him. I'm going to recite the clearance back to him. Taxi runway 18 left via taxiway Alpha. 25 Tango. So you can see I recited the clearance and I re-identified myself. Now you can use shorthand identification once you've already made your initial contact over here. Your initial contact should always be the full identification of the aircraft. Once you've already established communication and you're talking to the person, you can cut it down to the last, typically, 3 characters. And in case, just in case I have not been clear, kind of assumed that we already knew this, but if not, well, that's not what I wanted. Aircraft identification is the aircraft's registration, and for all U.S. registered aircraft, it's always printed somewhere on the fuselage, and it is it's a suffix with a November. So November 930 November for this aircraft. This one happens to be November 340 Lima Victor. It's November 38424. Anything that doesn't start with a November is a non-U.S. registered aircraft. So whatever this is, Golf Kilo Echo Lima Sierra, not a U.S. registered aircraft. Here's the aircraft. Here's the type of airplanes we fly. November 98710. So, all right. So let's do another example. I think I've got a bunch of them here. Okay, Class D airport, approach to landing. So this is actually the frequency that I've currently got paused on the speaker. But Sugar Land's a Class D airport. It's a blue-colored airport on our chart. It is surrounded by a dotted blue line, blue circle. So it's Class Delta. So here we go. Sugar Land Tower, November 1125 Tango is type PA28, 8 miles south of the field. 3,000 feet, inbound for touch and go, have information Bravo. So, real quick before too many questions come up, tree is actually not a misspelling. The number 3, the official phraseology for the number 3 in the world of aviation is, or the official pronunciation I should say, is tree. So perhaps you'll hear somebody say that on the frequency. It's 50-50. I typically don't use the word tree, but you'll hear it sometimes. You'll hear instead of 3,000 feet, you'll hear 3,000 feet. So who are we talking to? Sugar Land Tower. Who are we? November 1125 Tango, type PA28. Where are we? 8 miles south of the field or the airport. 3,000 feet. So now the controller knows exactly where we are. What do we want to do? Inbound for touch and go landing. Have information Bravo. This is my ATIS information. So just a couple things. Hopefully you guys are starting to get the hang of this a little bit, but just a couple quirks here that, you know, I want to point out and you'll become really good at as you start your flying. If you forget to tell the controller that you have the ATIS information, or let's say you forgot to get it and you don't have the ATIS information, the controller is likely to come back to you after you make this entire request and say, November 1125 Tango, Sugarland Tower, verify you have information Bravo. And then you're going to have to be like, shoot, I forgot to get the ATIS. So now you're in a tight spot because you're 8 miles from the airport, which is 3 miles from entering Class Delta airspace. And you've got to switch over to the ATIS frequency, which, if this is Sugarland, let's just, as an exercise, let's just do this, huh? Why not? Help us understand some of the stuff we've been talking about. So here's Sugarland Regional right here. And the ATIS is 118.125. So now I'm 8 miles south of the field. So I'm like somewhere down here by this lake. I'm coming in at probably like 130 knots, you know, I'm not moving slow. And I'm requesting to land, but I don't even have the ATIS. So it's very important when you're about to talk to a controller, especially if you're taking off and landing, operating inside and out of a terminal area, that you take the initiative to get the ATIS first, because they're going to tell you to get it if you don't have it. But assuming you have it, just another quirk I kind of wanted to point out. Take note that this statement here is more of a intention. More of an intention, less of a request. It's, hey, here's what I'm doing. I'm inbound for touch and go. I didn't say, can I do a touch and go, or requesting to do a touch and go. So it's stuff that you'll get used to as you start your flying, but keep this in mind. Class D airport. What are the requirements to enter a Class D airspace? If you remember back from a couple sessions ago, the only requirements you have to have are that you establish two-way radio communications with the tower controller. Class Bravo, like Houston Hobby and DFW and Bush Intercontinental, that's the only airspace that you have to have a clearance to enter, where you have to hear the controller say, November 1125 Tango cleared into the Bravo airspace. But Class Delta, so long as you have established radio communication, you don't need to ask for anything. Hence why this kind of phraseology is used. Sugarland Tower, November 1125 Tango, type PA28, 8 miles south of the field, 3,000 feet, inbound for touch and go, have information Bravo. Okay? Now the controller is going to come back and say, similar in similar fashion to the way we contacted him, November 1125 Tango, Sugarland Tower. And then he's going to give us an approach or a pattern entry clearance. Make left downwind, runway 18. Report abeam the numbers. So let's talk about abeam the numbers real quick. And I'm throwing a couple phrases in here because I want you guys to start learning some phrases. So abeam the numbers is a position in the traffic pattern. Say, here's my runway right here. Whew. And here's my traffic pattern. And we will talk about traffic patterns in the next session. But here's a traffic pattern around a runway that, and let's call this runway 18, just like the example. The downwind leg is this leg right here. The reason it's called downwind is because you're always landing into the wind. Here's my wind. And this direction is downwind. It's with the wind. Just at, same idea here. This direction is upwind. So the controller has asked me to make a left left, downwind, and report abeam the numbers. Well, the numbers he's talking about are 1-8, and those numbers are printed on the runway. And the abeam point is right here in the traffic pattern. So when I get to this point in the traffic pattern, I'm going to call him up, Sugarland Tower, November 1125 Tango, abeam the numbers, landing runway 18. And I will have fulfilled this this clearance. So again, November 1125 Tango, Sugarland Tower, make left downwind, runway 18, report abeam the numbers. I'm going to recite that clearance and then re-identify myself. Make left downwind, runway 18, will report abeam the numbers, 25 Tango. So I know that my pattern entry clearance is a left, downwind, and I'm going to report abeam the numbers right here. Okay. All right, I think I got one more. This is good stuff. I hope this is starting to sink in just even a little bit. But if you keep these 4 things in mind, you will have no problem keying the microphone and talking air traffic control. I guarantee it. All right, probably one of the most important things you will ask of air traffic control as a VFR pilot is VFR flight following, which we're going to talk a little bit about here on the next few slides. But from a requesting standpoint, just like we have in the last several examples, Houston Center, November 1125 Tango is type PA28 over the Leona VOR, 10,000 feet. Request VFR flight following, direct Dallas Love Field, student pilot. So let's go through this one. Who am I talking to? Houston Center. Who am I? November 1125 Tango. And what type of aircraft am I? PA28. Where am I? Over the Leona VOR, 10,000 feet. So now the controller knows exactly where I am. And what do I want to do? Request VFR flight following. Direct Dallas Love Field, meaning this is where I'm going. And something you're going to hear quite often, especially as you start your training, because this will be you speaking. At the end of my transmission, I'm going to say student pilot. It's an excellent way to let the controller know that he's dealing with somebody who needs just a little bit more time understanding the radio communications. Otherwise, the controller is going to speak as if he's speaking to everybody else. He's going to speak real quick. So, again, who am I talking to? Who am I? Where am I? What do I want to do? Now, in this case, this is going to be a request. It's not going to be an intention like the last one. Why? Because you can't assume as a VFR pilot that air traffic control is going to give you flight following. It is not a guaranteed thing. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So this particular transmission is going to be a request. And you can't be surprised if the controller comes back and says, -25 Tango, maintain VFR, and stand by, which means he doesn't have time for you right now, so stand by on frequency. All right, let's go over what the typical response is going to be. November 1125 Tango, Houston Center, squawk 2256, and ident. Well, let's go to a transponder because I want to look at the face of a transponder right now. Here's my transponder right here. So I'm going to key in the code. What was the code? 2256. So I'm going to hit the 2256, and it's going to enter in on the screen right there where the 1200 is. And then I'm going to hit the identification button, which is the IDT over here. And this is just another kind of thing I'm throwing in there because these are things that you'll pick up when you start your flight training. The identification button is a signal that causes a signal to show up on the radar screen, your airplane will not look like all the other radar returns. It's going to flash on the screen for the controller to find you easily. That's a built-in function of most transponders. Once you hit the ident, not only do you pop up on the controller screen because you just punched in the code, but now your airplane on the radar screen's flashing in bright colors, and the controller is going to easily see you. Okay, so November 1125 Tango, Houston Center, squawk 2256 and ident. Your response, you're going to recite his request. Squawk 2256, ident, 25 Tango. And then what you're going to hear, November 1125 Tango, radar contact, 10,000 feet over Leona VOR, Houston altimeter 2985. And this example goes just a little bit deeper into radar into air traffic control communications, but I feel like it's important, especially as you start your training, because once you do cross countries and are flying to other airports, you're going to get VFR flight following, and this is exactly what to expect from a communications perspective. So the controller, after you recite his request, the controller is going to come back when he sees you on the radar screen and re-identify you, November 1125 Tango, that's who he's talking to. And he's going to tell you that you are radar contact, meaning he has you on his screen. And then he's going to re-establish your position. And it's important to listen to this, because if he's incorrect, you've got to tell him. You say, hey, dude, you've got the wrong guy. But it's correct in this example, so we'll move on. He's going to then give you an altimeter setting. Why? When you request and are granted a VFR flight following, you are now in the radar terminal environment. You are going to be treated just like an aircraft on an instrument flight plan, which means you have to maintain vertical separation from other airplanes. The controller's job is to keep you and other aircraft from hitting each other. So he needs to ensure that your altimeter is set properly. And you will recite that. So he'll say Houston altimeter 2985. You will say roger that, 2985. 25 Tango. And then that'll be it. And you'll be on VFR flight following. All right, so those are some examples of what you're going to hear as you get your flight training started. Let's transition over to a subject matter that, and you know, we've talked about things like this throughout some of the classes. This particular subject matter, you're going to learn, you're going to master, and then there's a pretty good chance that you may never use it in real life. However, there's a very good chance that you might have to. And so you have to learn some of these things just in case. And of course, I've said it before, you'll have to show that you know some of this information on the flight test. You'll have to definitely show that you know it on the written test. Air traffic control light signals. So radio failures, two-way radio failures do happen on both sides of the microphone. So you could be flying along one day and your two-way radio craps out, or you could be flying into an airport with a control tower and their two-way radio could fail. Either case, if there is a reason for air traffic control and aircraft to communicate visually, meaning not over the radios, they are going to communicate via light gun signals. And this is the universally accepted legend for what each signal means. You can see that there is a steady and a flashing definition for each color. And there's also a definition for each color, whether you're in the air or on the ground. So if you're in the air and you're coming into land, let's say you request landing clearance, and between the time that you get your landing clearance and the time you land, you lose your radios. Well, if you see a steady green light from the tower, then you can be assured that you're still cleared to land. If you see a flashing red light from the tower, then you cannot land. So there are numerous, I would say, examples of flight situations and ground situations when these lights will come into play. And you'll need to be prepared to discuss their use to the examiner, to your flight instructor during the written test. It's a challenge though, because once you get your ticket, once you've been certificated as a private pilot, I mean, this stuff barely ever happens. I've been flying since 2001, and I've never encountered air traffic control light gun signals. So, and you know, I don't have tens of thousands of hours, but it's just something that you need to know for when it happens. So this will be a big part of your studying for the written test. So in summary, there are steady state and flashing colors, red, green, white, and alternating. And then there's different definitions for whether you're on the ground or if you're in the air. Let's walk through an example. So you are on a cross country from your home airport to San Antonio International, which is a Class Charlie airport. And the tower controller loses his radios. He goes what we call Nordo, which means you don't have any radios. However, there's still a bunch of airplanes in the air that need to land. So in that example, busy airport, busy airspace, Class Charlie airspace, there is a very good chance that the approach controller, who is the controller that speaks to you prior to handing you off to the tower controller, a very good chance that the approach controller is going to put all the airplanes in a holding pattern. Why? Because the radios at the airport are down. There's no way that they can quickly and expeditiously and safely get all the airplanes to land in a timely manner. So they're probably going to put everybody in a holding pattern and clear each airplane to land one at a time. So, and this is just an example. I'm not really, I didn't read this in the newspaper. I'm not sure this has ever happened, but here's your airport. Here's your control tower right here. And here's your holding pattern with all your airplanes in it. And we're not going to talk too much about holding patterns because that's an instrument flight rules topic. But here we go. We're in the holding pattern. We're right here. Here's another airplane. We've got a bunch of airplanes in the holding pattern. Maybe we're at different altitudes. Who knows? And so what they typically will have is a holding pattern for the approach controller, meaning each airplane in this holding pattern is going to be talking to the approach controller. And the approach controller is going to clear an airplane out of this holding pattern one by one into another holding pattern where they only allow one airplane in at a time. So let's just say, for sake of the example, we're right here and the approach controller clears us to the next holding pattern. So here we go. We're going over here. We're going to join this holding pattern. Well, now's when we're going to look for the light gun signals. And the approach controller will probably tell us that, cleared to the next holding pattern, be on the lookout for light gun signals, and we'll acknowledge that. So we'll be in this holding pattern looking for light gun signals coming from the tower. And presumably the first light gun signal we're going to see is a steady red light, which is the continue circling light. So we're going to circle and circle and circle. until we see the flashing green light. Return for landing. Once we get into, I would say, aligned with the runway and in a position where the controller feels, the tower controller feels good enough to clear us for landing, that flashing green light will turn steady green, and we'll get a cleared to land signal. So just one of probably several types of examples that one could come up with for the use of light gun signals. But you want to know the definition of each, and you want to know how they would be used in flight. All right, let's talk VFR flight following. This is a relatively important topic. VFR flight following is air traffic control radar services for participating VFR visual flight rules aircraft. Instrument flight rules IFR aircraft are always in communications with air traffic control. But as we've discussed in prior sessions, the participation of VFR traffic with air traffic control is optional, so long as you're in an airspace where it's optional. VFR flight following is an as-available service. So I had mentioned in a prior slide, air traffic control is not required to give you flight following, but as you're going to find as you start your flight training, you will typically always get it. I don't think I've ever been refused VFR flight following. It's a huge FAA initiative. At any time, at any period of time in the sky, there's tens of thousands of airplanes. Only a small fraction of those airplanes are actually talking air traffic control. The more airplanes that are talking air traffic control, the safer the skies are, quite frankly. So ATC is typically not going to refuse a flight following request unless they're absolutely just way too busy, or if you call them up at an awkward, either awkward distance to a certain airspace, or for example, you don't want to call up air traffic control and request VFR flight following direct to an airport if you're, say, like 2 miles from that airport. Good example here, San Antonio class Charlie. There's even a requirement here on the chart down here where my mouse pointer is. Contact San Antonio approach within 20 nautical miles on 128.05. So if I want VFR flight following, I'm gonna follow this request. I'm gonna contact San Antonio approach within 20 nautical miles of the airport and request my VFR flight following. I'm not going to call them when I am on the edge of the airspace. It's very likely that they're not going to comply because I just waited way too long. And you'll get a better feel for that stuff when you start your flight training. But all in all, air traffic control is going to comply. They want to talk to you. You're going to get sequencing with approaching and departing aircraft, and you're going to get traffic advisories. You will be handled more or less like an aircraft on an instrument flight plan. To the controller, you're just another target on his radar return, and he's going to vector you and give you altitude requests and give you traffic advisories, let you know when other aircraft are transitioning in your area to ensure that you see that aircraft. So it's really a good service. Contacting air traffic control to get a flight following, you're going to do that either in flight or on the ground. If you're in flight, it's going to be whichever controlling agency controls the airspace that you're in. So that's going to be either the approach or the center controller. Tower controllers are typically only used for landing and departing aircraft. So they are not going to be giving you any VFR flight following. That's going to be your approach or your center controllers. And if you want to request or line up a flight following before you even leave the airport, take off, you can actually line that up through the ground controller. And what the ground controller is going to do is he's going to take your request, he's going to get on the phone, he's going to call the approach controller or the center controller, and he's going to do the request for you while you're on the ground. And the approach controller or the center controller is going to come back and tell the ground controller on the phone, yeah, sure, that sounds great. Give him this squawk code, squawk 1234. And you're going to throw that into your transponder. So the ground controller will come back and give you your squawk code. It's very very convenient, very good way to get flight following. You don't even have to think about it when you take off. You've already got it. Something to keep in mind when you're on flight following is that the controller, either the approach or the center controller, his radar screen is giving him information relative to your aircraft's ground track, not your aircraft's heading. So this is important because when it comes to sequencing and separating traffic, you're going to get different heading requests from the controller. You know, the controller sees a big jumbo jet in front of you. He's going to say, November 1125 Tango, traffic 12 o'clock, moving to your left, turn right to heading 020. And then you're going to respond, turn left 020, November 1125 Tango. And what he means is he wants to see your ground track change to 020, not your heading. He doesn't know what direction your nose is pointed. He can only see what the radar is telling him, which is your ground track. The radar return gives him the physical direction that your aircraft is traveling. He has no idea. The transponder and the radar do not have the capability to tell him that your nose is pointed to the right because there's this like 30-knot crosswind coming from your left. Make sense? So if there's heavy crosswinds or heavy winds aloft, you're going to want to keep that in mind. Your nose, to compensate for where you're going, your nose is not going to be pointed in the same direction as your ground track. And you need to keep that in mind when communicating with air traffic control during VFR flight following. Let's go over to our different tools that we're going to have for flight planning and figure out how we're going to contact these different controlling agencies. So, of course, we talked about the ground controller method, and we've talked about the region or the approach and center controlling method. The easiest way that I have found to get different controlling agency frequencies is through the chart supplement. Ideally, it's really the most official, easiest way to do so. And we're going to walk through it right here. Of course, you can do this online. You can do this. You can buy this in paper version. But let's just let's not do that. Let's search. So let's say, I'm going to depart. Let's just, let's plan a flight from Sugar Land to San Antonio. And didn't like that, did it? So here we go. Boom. So there's our flight from Sugar Land to San Antonio. And let's say upon departure from Sugar Land, I'm going to pick up flight following. And for whatever reason, I'm not going to do it through ground control. Maybe I'm in a hurry. I want to get taxiing. I want to get going. So I'm planning to do it after I depart the airport. So how am I going to do that? Well, that's going to be through either my approach controller or my center controller, depending on where I'm at in the airspace, whether I'm, here or out here. But let's figure it out. So we're going to go to the chart supplement for Sugar Land. Let's do it. There we go. Remember, this is the publication that gives us all sorts of good information about the airport. And what we're going to see here down at the bottom of the screen is a bunch of different frequencies. One of them being right here, Houston Approach and Departure Control, 123.8. So if I'm planning to pick up VFR flight following after departing Sugar Land in and around the Sugar Land terminal area, meaning shortly after takeoff, I'm going to contact 123.8 Houston Approach, and I'm gonna say Houston Approach, November 1125 Tango, type PA28, just off of Sugar Land, 2 miles to the west. Direct San Antonio, request flight following. And the controller is going to come back and say, November 1125 Tango, Houston Approach, squawk 1234. Because remember, to give me flight following, he has to be able to see me on his radar screen. And I'm going to say, squawk 1234, 25 Tango. And momentarily, when he's got me on his scope, he'll say November 1125 Tango, radar contact, 2 miles west of the Sugar Land Regional Airport. And then he'll give me an altimeter setting. Sugar Land altimeter 299 Or maybe he'll, because it's a busy terminal area, maybe he'll actually want to give me an altitude restriction. November 1125 Tango, radar contact 2 miles west of the Sugar Land Regional Airport. Climb and maintain 4,000 feet. To which I'll recite that. Climb and maintain 4,000, 25 Tango. So hopefully you guys are starting to get the hang of the lingo a little bit. You know what? Let's say that I forgot, or I didn't want to get VFR flight following right after I took off. Let's say I get all the way the heck out here, and I'm like, you know what? It'd really be nice to have VFR flight following. Let's say I'm over Dreyer Memorial. Tango 20 is the airport code. Well, again, the easiest way that I have found to determine which air traffic controlling agency owns the airspace or controls the airspace around an airport is the chart supplement. If you've got your iPad and you've got ForeFlight, this is very easy. But you can also purchase the chart supplement from the FAA. That's where ForeFlight gets its information. So let's go to Tango 20 and pull it up. Now, some airports, I am doing this kind of blindly. I did not review this before the class. Some airports don't have approach or center frequencies to help them, to help the pilots along. So this appears to be one of those. I'm here at the Dreyer Memorial Tango 20. The only communications frequencies that I'm seeing is the CTAF, which we talked about. VOR frequencies. Here's AWOS, which we have not talked about. That stands for Automated Weather Observation Service. That's a weather frequency. That's similar to the ATIS. But there is no approach or center here, so never mind on that. But that doesn't get rid of our problem, right? We're still out here in the middle of nowhere, and we're wanting to talk to somebody. So the next best place to find a frequency is actually on an approach plate. Now, some instructors and some pilots will tell you that you don't need to carry approach plates until you're an instrument rated pilot, but I highly disagree. for the reason I'm about to walk through right now. Let's go to the Dreyer Memorial approach plates. Now, this is one where you're going to have the approach plate publications, or you're going to have ForeFlight, because obviously you're not going to have this you're not going to be able to pull this website up in the airplane. But either you've got what's called the FAA approach plates, which is an instrument, which are instrument procedures, or you've got ForeFlight or any number of electronic flight bags. And hey, what do you know? There's not even instrument procedures here at Tango 20. So at this point, and I'm really glad we picked this example, because it shows, you know, an airport that probably not a good reference point, because I can't get the frequency for center or approach by looking in my chart supplement. I can't get it by looking at my approach plate, because approach plates don't exist. So my only option at this point is to pick a different airport. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick Randolph Air Force Base. That's the next one along the way. So Sierra Echo Quebec. So let's go back to our chart supplement. Oh, military bases are not in the chart supplement. So let's pick a public use airfield. Let's pick New Braunfels. This will be easy. I know this one will probably work. BAZ. Let's go to our chart supplement. We'll pull up BAZ in our chart supplement. And here we go. So it turns out that in this particular region that we're flying in, the controlling agency is San Antonio Approach, 124.45. So if I'm flying along, back to our example, if I'm in the general vicinity, and let's say I did not get my flight following back here when I took off, but I desire to get it now, I'm going to call San Antonio Approach, 124.45. Now, just because a great many of us fly with an electronic flight bag, let's just go through that example as well, where to find frequencies in the electronic flight bag. I'll draw my... Okay, there's my course line. And let's say I'm in this general vicinity like the last example, and I'm going to go ahead and click BAZ there. Now, if you're on your iPad, you just kind of have to tap it with your finger. But here we go. Here's the information, pops up. And what do you know? San Antonio Approach is right there. So if I need to get VFR flight following in this general vicinity, I'm going to be calling San Antonio Approach 124.45. Now, I'll show you what the approach plate looks like as well, just in case you do want to get good at looking at approach plates as a VFR pilot. We'll pull up an approach plate here. And you can get your frequencies at the top of the approach plate. There's your 124.45. So multiple sources of information for the same frequency. You just have to find the right airport. Let's see if ForeFlight has a frequency in Tango 20. It might. Not too sure how to get it here on the web, so I got to add it as a waypoint. No, it doesn't. So Tango 20 is not represented by any sort of approach frequencies. It doesn't mean that you can't call approach while you're close to that airport. It just means that it's not in the airport information. So again, VFR flight following, it's more or less a very good, essential method of obtaining air traffic control radar services as a VFR pilot. If you're on a cross-country flight, it's definitely recommended. Air traffic control definitely wants to talk to you. They want to make sure you're part of the known identified traffic on their radar scope. Couple more just bullet points on the transponder. We're kind of coming up on time here, but transponders, which we discussed a little bit in a couple sessions ago, and again this session, of course, it's the device that allows radar to track your aircraft. You have the ability to put a 4-digit code in the transponder, and transponders come in 3 typical types. They are mode alpha, mode Charlie, mode Sierra, over here at the top of this slide. And each mode has kind of a different, I'll say, level of functionality. Mode Sierra is the most functional, meaning it carries the most functionality. Mode alpha carries the least, I guess you could say. Mode alpha is code capable, meaning you can plug a code in and be identified. And it can transmit that code to the radar scope. So the controller can give you a squawk code, you can plug that in, and then it'll show up on their screen with your code. Step up a level, and mode C takes a coded transponder and couples it with an altitude encoding altimeter, so that not only can your code show up on the screen, but also your altitude. And if you remember from airspace discussion, in order to transition or enter a Class Bravo airspace, you must have at least a Mode C transponder. And then Mode Sierra is kind of all of the above. It's ADS-B capable, meaning the aircraft will transmit altitude, speed, call sign identification, and other information to the controller. It's extremely comprehensive. It takes a Mode C. It's kind of on steroids. You know, you would technically not even have to give the controller your identification number, your November 1125 Tango. It's already going to be on his radar screen. All civil aircraft have to have a Mode S ADS-B out transponder by the year 2020. So that's something that every aircraft owner is kind of getting in line right now to get their Mode S capable transponders installed. A couple codes to keep in mind, because air traffic control may request that you enter a code into your transponder. But if you're just flying VFR out and about and not talking air traffic control, you will be squawking 1200. That's the Universal Visual Flight Rules code. And when you get into your aircraft, typically your squawk setting will already be set to 1200. And then there's 3 more emergency codes. You got a hijack code, a NORDO code, and the Universal Emergency Code. The 7500 is hijack. It means your aircraft's been hijacked. The 7600 is the code that means your radios have stopped working. Your NORDO, you don't have any two-way communications. And 7700 is the Universal Mayday code. So, for example, if you're flying along and your engine fails, at some point before you put the aircraft on the ground, you will switch your transponder over to 7700, so that anybody watching you on a radar screen that's picking up your transponder code will notice that you have an emergency. And today's radar technology, a lot of the radar scopes that the controllers have will be designed to alert the controller if one of these codes is entered. So the minute you enter 7700, it's not like the controller might see it. Alarm bells go off. Things start alerting the controller that, hey, we've got a pilot out there. You may not be talking to him, but he is in a distress state, and his distress state depends on what code comes up, 75, 76, or 7700. And then there's the dreaded military intercept code. And you never really want to have to deal with this. If for some reason you've got to be intercepted or dealing with the military in any way, shape, or form midair, that'll be the code that you enter into your transponder, and you'll be requested to enter that code by the intercepting aircraft. So let's say you accidentally fly through a temporary flight restriction because President Trump is playing golf in Houston. Shortly, you will be flanked by an F-16 or an F-15, and the F-15 or the F-16 is going to hold up a digital sign that says squawk quadruple seven, and change your frequency to 121.5 so they can talk to you. And then they're going to escort you back to an airport and probably point a gun to your head or something like that. So, different types of transponder modes, mode alpha, Charlie, Sierra, and then some standard codes, both emergency and then the universal VFR code 1200. And finally, another piece of equipment in the aircraft that, deals with air traffic control is the emergency locator transmitter, or the ELT, as you'll hear it called for short. In short, and the ELT is is kind of a destruction-proof box that is designed to transmit a signal if the aircraft is put into a distress state. Now, what do I mean by that? You're flying along, and you have an engine failure, and you commence an emergency procedure to land the aircraft without your engine. And let's say things don't go as well as planned, and you have a controlled crash, and the aircraft breaks apart maybe. This box is designed so that when it is involved in an accident, that it emits a signal, an audible signal that can be heard on a specific frequency. And that frequency is what's called the guard frequency, which is 121.5. And that audible signal, so long as the battery in this device is fully charged, will transmit for up to 48 hours. And this enables emergency crews, air traffic control, surrounding aircraft to find your airplane in a distressed state. I'm not sure if you guys followed the news when the Malaysia Air 777 went down a couple years ago, but this was the device that the authorities, the search parties, were attempting to find, the ELT. Since it was aircraft was in a distressed state, they were hoping that by tuning into 121.5, they might be able to hear this audible signal. And of course, as your transmitter gets closer to as your radio receiver gets closer to the ELT, the signal gets stronger, so you can find the distressed aircraft. A couple things to know that are useful for your flight exam and your written test. These ELTs are in the back of the airplane typically, and testing shall be performed on them in the first 5 minutes of any hour. It's kind of known as the ELT period, testing period. Why is this? It's so that if you hear an ELT going off in the first 5 minutes of any hour, it might not be an emergency. If you test your ELT outside of the first 5 minutes, well, someone flying by on the guard frequency might think that an aircraft had crashed nearby. So they designate the first 5 minutes of any hour to be the ELT testing period. And as well, to ensure that the batteries are fully charged in case anything does happen, you need to replace them after 50% of their useful life. Or if you do transmit for more than 1 hour. So if you're, if you accidentally set your ELT off and it goes off for more than 1 hour, you've got to replace your battery. If you take your aircraft in for an annual inspection, and the mechanic tells you that the battery is past its 50% past its useful life, you've got to change the battery. So keep these two items in mind as specific study points for your flight test and your written test. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of the air traffic control introductory material. I really hope, even though learning how to speak on the frequency is, it's involved. There's a lot to learn. It's not going to be easy to pick up everything at once. It's better to start with one thing at a time, like talking to the ground controller or requesting VFR flight following. But over time, you really are going to pick it up. And after you have 20, 25 hours under your belt, you probably be pretty good at talking air traffic control. Keep getting the basics down. So study up on some of the general phraseology. I would maybe reference some of these example slides that I've got as typical radio communication procedures that you'll hear between controller and pilot. And liveatc.net's great. I mean, I think when you're listening to liveatc.net and you're kind of just listening to pilots and controllers talk to each other, keep this in mind. The four call them main, highlight the four areas when you're calling into a controller. Who are you talking to? Who are you and what's your type? Where are you and what do you want to do? And, once you have that down, it really helps you, get on the frequency and get talking, because that can be probably the most difficult thing, is keying the mic for the first time and getting on the frequency, having yourself heard. So I will forward you guys the video for this week, the investigation video. It's a good one. And then I'll post this. You guys can watch it at your leisure. And please let me know what questions you have. If anything was confusing, or if you want me to clarify anything or go over anything, give me a shout, email, phone call's good. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. We'll talk to you this weekend. Okay. Have a good evening.